So welcome to week 4 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University. So as I'm speaking, or as I'm talking about this, the only announcement I have is the Trump shooting. And I'm taping this on a Saturday night about 3 hours after that. So there's a very little information coming in, or at least I have a very limited information picture. I suspect when you watch this, more information will be come out on what happened, how it happened, the identity of the shooter, etc. But for now, I want to I want to get beyond the political issues that come up, and I've seen all sorts of political issues on Twitter. But I want to talk about the failure here. And I will just say that despite the massive protection that Trump had, a guy was still able to get within shooting range of him with relative ease. How did this happen? Where did the Secret Service fall down on that? And then I also want to look, again, I'm speculating here, but I suspect when we know the identity of the shooter, we'll know that he probably had all sorts of political leanings and he was probably open about it, either with friends or on his social media. And the question is, how did that happen? How did someone that might have had all sorts of thoughts out there still be able to conduct this? And I don't know what the answer is going to be to that question. But I will just say, on behalf of the Secret Service or Capitol Hill Police or anybody else, the number of people that say these things on social media amounts to the hundreds of thousands to the millions. So after the fact, you can point out, look at all this social media, look at how do you not figure out this guy was so bad. But during or before the fact, it is in a sea of social media posts and political posts, etc. that go forward. So just keep that in mind as we know more about information, as we get more coverage going forward. So paper one, everyone should have paper one back except for onesies and twosies that were getting back to me a little bit later. Again, most people did well. I just want to emphasize I grade the papers a lot harder than the discussion boards. Most of you get full credit on discussion boards. Almost no one will get full credit on the papers. I grade them with a far more careful eye. Just a couple of things. Again, for most part, the requirements were too broad. And I talked to many of you on the phone about this, and I mentioned it on the discussion board as well. Too broad, too big of a statement. Narrow is the only thing I would say. This will China invade Taiwan? And again, not someone in this class, but another class did it. That's the example of way too broad of a question. What capabilities does China have to present an air and missile blockade over Taiwan is a lot more narrower of a question going forward. In fact, you could easily do 5 requirements based on that overall topic. Policy versus intel requirement. I mentioned this in last week's discussion, but again, you don't want to say, is the Border Patrol doing a good job of policing the border between Nogales and Sierra Vista, Arizona? That's not what you want to say. You want to turn it over and make it a threat-based requirement to say, are the cartels using the open border between Nogales and Sierra Vista to smuggle in fentanyl or other nefarious aspects? You understand the difference between the two. The second is a threat-based requirement. The first is a policy-based requirement. So you want to focus on threat-based for your papers. And then some of you brought this up. We didn't talk about social media exploitation in our class, but I think it's worthy of mentioning because many of you brought that up as a potential to exploit. And I'll just say, yes, in some cases it's good, some cases it's not. If you want to evaluate North Korean nuclear capabilities, social media is not going to be good for that. If you want to look at MS-13 in Fairfax County, social media is not the best avenue for that. In fact, MS-13 tends to radicalize and recruit normally in face-to-face environments. So just again, social media is important, but it's not a panacea for everything. So week 3 review, again, we had the Pearl Harbor case study and the Yom Kippur War case study. And what I want you to kind of take away are the schools of intelligence failure regarding anytime we see surprise, strategic surprise. So Pearl Harbor had it, 9/11, you're going to see it, a Yom Kippur War, Capitol Hill case study, and then even the October 7th Israel attack. So I want to kind of give you a lens here to look at when we have traditional case study and what were the causes of the failure. So the first is the traditional school. This argues that the failure occurred because analysts were just overwhelmed with information. It is easy, just like I talked about a second ago with the Trump assassination, it is easy to look after the fact what were the key indicators, key pieces of information. However, you will never know before the fact that this was the key information because, again, it'll be in a sea of information, sea of other data points. So the argument of the traditional school is you're overwhelmed with information, you can't separate the wheat from the chaff, and this is inevitable, that you'll never know the key indicators beforehand. This argument was made by a woman named Roberta Wallstetter, and it was made at the dawn of the nuclear age in the 1950s and 1960s. And her argument was that, again, if there's a nuclear war against the United States, we're not going to see it beforehand. We're not going to see those potential indicators. And we have to make sure that we're prepared for nuclear war, that we have second strike forces, that we have more advanced capability, because if there's a nuclear war, we're not going to have an analysis of what happened afterward because we're all going to be one big smoking parking lot. So this was the traditionalist school, and this is what she argued was the cause of Pearl Harbor, or the intelligence failure cause. The second is the reformist school. This argues, no, we do have enough information. We're not overwhelmed it, but the right information doesn't get to the right people. And this argument's made by the descendants of Admiral Kimmel and General Short. And they say, with some merit, that information was collected at the Washington, D.C. level, at the secretaries and the service level G2s and N2s in Washington who had decryption and who were looking at the diplomatic cables. But this information was not shared with the commanders on the ground. And this argues that, again, because of bureaucracy, bureaucratic inertia, security reasons, that information is not shared downward or horizontally. And the argument is, if you're an analyst, you'll see this in the 9/11 case study, see it here. If you're an analyst in Washington, your boss and the guy who cuts your paycheck is above you, so you're going to share information upward, but not think about sharing information horizontally or downward. So that's the reformist school. And the third is the contrarian school, and this is kind of the opposite of the traditional school. This argues is, no, there wasn't enough information, that the failure occurred in collection, that there was not enough collection, and that's why Pearl Harbor happened. And you can make this argument with the carriers. So 6 aircraft carriers, by the key asset of the Japanese fleet, their location and disposition was not known until December 7th. So that is the contrarian school. This argues, again, there was not enough collection assets to determine what happened. Then you have the Dahl thesis. This argues is the failures didn't occur in the requirements or collection or analysis, but the problem was briefing to policymakers, that the failure occurred in that chain, that the intelligence wasn't presented in a way that a policymaker would be more receptive to it. And this is the argument is that Dahl makes is that there was not enough tactical intelligence, that there wasn't enough specificity, and therefore the commanders on the ground couldn't have made appropriate countermeasures. I think highly of Dahl. I think highly of his thesis, and that's why I'm signing him in this class. But I'll just go one step further and say, rarely do you get the data do you get enough information with the specificity that he is actually looking for? For those of you who are in Iraq, you might have been familiar, or Afghanistan, you might be familiar with improvised explosive devices. These were these bombs that killed thousands of Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is no piece of intelligence that tells you the IED is going to be located at this location on this road intersection at this time by this person. That level of specificity doesn't occur. So what you need to do is have enough intelligence to drive risk mitigation circumstances. And that brings me to the last school, the Sharma School. It's not really the Sharma School. It is mainly the use of intelligence to drive risk mitigation. Again, you're not going to get the specificities that you might have wanted as a ground commander. But what you should get enough in the intelligence cycle is enough for the commanders to mitigate risk. Enough, precision may not be the right word, but enough data so they can make reasonable countermeasures to mitigate risk. Now, what do I mean by that in the Pearl Harbor case study? Again, arguably, there was enough data out there that between the intelligence and between even what was out in the deteriorating political situation, that the commanders on the ground could have made reasonable force protection measures. Extend the range of aircraft, push aircraft out for longer reconnaissance, put submarines out for longer reconnaissance. Have the defense attaché in Japan run up and down. There's no CIA at the time, but his responsibility would have been to run up and down, and if not find those 6 aircraft carriers, at least determine where they are not. So all of these things could have been implemented that were reasonable. Moving the fleet back to San Diego is not reasonable, but certain countermeasures, certain risk assessments could have been implemented, and they were not. And to give you the example, during the 2 waves of the Pearl Harbor attack, the first wave was very successful. The second wave suffered a lot of casualties from the Japanese perspective and wasn't successful because the Americans had a 1-hour alert. And they were able to man aircraft, scramble, have fighters on even a haphazard patrol, have gunners manned on their anti-aircraft batteries. Those small mitigation circumstances would have prevented or seriously impacted the Pearl Harbor attack if it did occur, or when it occurred. So on to Yom Kippur again. Some similar aspects: over-reliance on HUMINT, on the source, as you saw, the Marwan source, addiction to preconceived notions. And this was, again, the concept, the belief that Egypt wouldn't attack Israel unless the Israeli Air Force was mitigated. And then the lack of kind of a thorough intelligence assessment. What I mean by an intelligence assessment, an asymmetric intelligence assessment, there was no look at aircraft. There was, the Israelis had advantage in aircraft to aircraft, tanks to tanks. What they didn't look at a more thorough net assessment is aircraft to anti-aircraft missile, tank to anti-tank missile. And that led to kind of that surprise on the first day of the Yom Kippur War that you saw in the Al Jazeera documentary. So these were the intelligence failures. I will let you decide, again, where you think the school of thought, the intel or the failure occurred in Yom Kippur War. And just keep in mind, we are now looking at Yom Kippur War. The 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War was the October 7th attack in 2023. And a lot of similar comparisons are made. I'm going to ask you to look at that in detail in one of your final papers. So week 4 preview. A lot of work this week. A lot of discussion, a lot of reading. I just want to kind of break down 2 case studies, Iraq WMD and 9/11. I just want to emphasize again, Iraq WMD, you're going to watch the Rachel Maddow documentary. Again, she's a political actor, so take it with a grain of salt. but there's nothing really that she says there that isn't factually correct or incorrect. So, so watch that. Watch the 60 Minutes Curveball. The committee report is 200 pages. Do not read 200 pages. Focus on the blue boxes for the reading. And then if there's more that arouses your curiosity, just go into more detail. But I just want you to read the summary blue boxes going forward. And then you have my lectures. And then 9/11, you have the documentaries. Again, a lot of documentaries this week. National Geographic and Nova NSA. You have the readings. And then you have my lecture. And as you're going through my lectures, think of how 9/11 could be prevented. So if there's any questions or issues, let me know. But I look forward to your discussions for this week.